You want one?
I'll send around the electronic version of that. It's something I got on Monday, I think.
Good.
That would be great.
The guys there will say, really, hey, you have to be taken a different way because she runs.
Right.
Folks, welcome to today's Priest Brownbag. Let's see, before I introduce our speaker, we have several different events going on this week. Most of them are related. I think you saw the fairly full agenda that I sent you. A lot of them are related to the Open Access Week that we're celebrating here at KU. So there are various lectures devoted to that. John,
Sure. Okay, everyone, make sure you come tomorrow.
Right here. In fact, I think we have you to thank for organizing a number of these different events related to.
The one tomorrow, yeah. I'll be the moderator on that.
And what's the theme is on international education?
Tomorrow it's on open learning. So Jonathan Burke's going to be talking about some of the digital projects they've done, Ukrainian textbook materials. Emeritus is going to talk about Acceso, which is the Spanish language digital textbook that they've created. It's been marketed. And Kate Cunningham's going to talk about her role in helping with that. And then Kim Glover's going to talk about these massive online kind of course technologies that's coming out of MIT and other things. So come to that. And then on a Thursday, Mark Greenberg's going to be talking about the international impact of open access, along with several other people. There's several people from the biosciences, and they have some really interesting things to say.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, sure.
The other elements that are going on as far as Crease is concerned, we're celebrating the 80th birthday of Milos Forman, and we're going to be showing out dais on Thursday. Svetlana Vasileva Kargioza is going to be introducing that. So it's not on Friday, our regular night for movies. It's going to be in here on Thursday night at 7 p.m. Should be really a lot of fun. And then on Friday, there's something that we were sent just recently that has to do, it seems like Georgia is on our minds this entire semester, but there is a lecture that's going to be devoted to applying behavioral psychology to humanitarian projects in the nation of Georgia, put on by Barry Parnson and Jean Mary Rawls, who I believe one of them or both of them are KU graduates, but they're now in New Zealand. And that's going to happen at 3:30 p.m. at the Dole Human Development Center, room 2092.
What day is that?
Sorry, that's on Friday at 3:30 p.m. So our speaker today is Norman Saul, Professor Emeritus in the Department of History, recently retired, although you would know from the regime of conferences that he attends, both here and overseas, and also does a heck of a job conducting outreach for history and KU and Crease, talking about various topics in Kansas and around the region, and is perhaps best well known for a series of books written on, he wrote first a historical dictionary of United States-Russian Soviet relations, and then also a series of books on sort of the history of U.S.-Russian or Russian-U.S. Diplomatic history, which informs the topics that we speaking to us today.
Thank you, Bart, and I also want to acknowledge his help in putting some of these slides together. And the cartoon background here, he found that. Abraham Lincoln and I guess Alexander II shaking hands or greeting each other, which is what I'm going to talk about. This comes from a conference I was invited to attend a year ago, almost exactly. In fact, the conference was October 2021, 2011, in Volgograd. And the title of the conference was Russia and the American Civil War. And the proceedings have just been published, although they're not readily available. I have a email attached copy. It's about 400 pages of a journal called Americana, which is at the top of the list on that selected bibliography. I have the summaries that I printed out and will pass around. My report or article is the only one in English, since I was the only non-Russian attending that conference. There were 23, I think, papers delivered. I was very impressed by the quality of the Russian work on the subject of Russia and the American Civil War. And in Volgograd, of all places. But that was due to Ivan Kurila, who was an expert on Russian-American relations in that period, 19th century generally. And I hope we will have him here in February or March, since he is now a visiting professor at George Washington University in Washington. So we can look forward to that. So I'll pass this around. The annotations of the articles are in English, except for one, mine, which is in Russian. So it's a fascinating subject, I think, and one that's been neglected in historical literature. The contribution that Russia and some Americans who were involved in Russia made to the Union, saving the Union. And I could have made it more definite how Russia saved the Union, but they contributed certainly to the outcome, and that's what I'll be talking about. Just a few other items I wanted to mention on the bibliography. Bokovitanov is a long-term friend associated. I've been sometimes called the Bokovitanov of America, since I deal with some of the same period and everything of Russian-American relations that he did. Ivan Kurila, I've already mentioned, here's one of his books on Russian-American relations. Kuropatnik, another very old dear friend, and his recent book on the Civil War, I'll pass around. My book on distant friends, which covers the subject, and there are a few pictures, I think, noted there that are relevant. Sogren is also, he's the replacement of Bokovitanov as the head of the Center of North American Studies of the Academy of Sciences. And this is a magisterial work on American history. It's over 600 pages and covers all of American history. I don't think any American historian has come close to that in recent years, at least. And then, let's see, I guess I skipped over a book by Starr. Yes, it's on there. Seward. I just got this. It's off the press on William Henry Seward, Lincoln's right hand. So anyway, those are some, just a few things on archives. The archives are mixed as to available literature. The archive that I relied on a lot for the Russian side was the archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Moscow. And I was able to use back in the 70s, early 80s, when I had opportunity there. But it's become more difficult, I'm told, by Americans and Russians to get access to anything dealing with Russian foreign affairs. So that's problematical as to getting back into there. I think there's a lot there to deal with. That you could write a history, a book, a history of the American Civil War as Russia saw it, from the records, the reports that the minister of Russia to the United States wrote back to St. Petersburg on a weekly basis throughout the whole war. He was there through the whole period. And I don't think I'll be able to do it, but certainly someone should try to do that work. The archives in America, of course, are pretty wide open and almost too open. There's so much there. But the Cassius Clay papers, which are scattered, they're in Tennessee at Harrogate University, at the Filson Club in Cincinnati, and other places. But there's a lot there because he lived a long life and wrote a lot. So sifting through all that material is not easy to do, but it is a task, and I think more people should do it. We'll look at those papers. And something I discovered, and I don't know how I found it, that when he went to Russia as the minister and was there through most of the Civil War period, he took along, for the first stint, he was there 2 different times. He took a breather, you might say, trying to get a commission to command an army in the Union forces. That didn't turn out, so he went back to Russia. So that his opportunity was kind of lost in that process. But Green Clay was his nephew, who kept a diary, day-by-day diary. And guess where it is? It's in the Western Missouri Historical Society at UMKC, just not very far away. But no one that I know of has ever used it except me. And it's a very good source. It just goes to show you how things are out there and can be found. And I'm sure there's much more that hasn't been discovered yet on this subject. I'll not talk any more about the archives, except maybe referring to them a little bit as we go on. But, get back to where we are. A bit of the background and why America and Russia were so close during this period. Trade relations were very close. Russia imported huge quantities of cotton from the south, of course, but they were hauled to Russia by northern ships, Yankee clippers out of New England for the most part. There was a mutual Anglophobia that cemented the countries together, going back to the Civil War. Russia was in a process of modernization, steam navigation. They looked to America for examples, the Hudson, Mississippi, and so forth, for navigating Russian rivers, the Volga, and so on. Railroads was a big thing, and the first major railroad that was built between St. Petersburg and Moscow was surveyed by Americans and built largely by Americans, with, of course, Russian peasant labor. The manifest destinies they talked about. You go east, we go west, and we're both in the same, doing the same thing, bridging continents. Alexander Bodisco had established himself as a widely respected and even diplomat and socialite in Washington as the Russian minister between 1815 and 1830, no, I'm sorry, 1830 and 1854, when he died falling from a horse in Rock Creek Park. And he's buried, you can see the cemetery from Rock Creek Park if you drive up through there, the Bodisco Monument and burial ground. The Bodisco family would stay in America, the relatives, descendants, and so on. Anyway, he was the chair of the diplomat, the chief diplomat in Washington, senior diplomat, and was there during the Crimean War. And of course, America was very friendly and supportive of Russia during the Crimean War. About 30, 40 American surgeons served with the Russian army during the Crimean War. Another thing which I found was General Admiral, the largest ship ever built in America at the time, the largest ship ever in the Russian Navy up to that time, was the flagship of the Russian Navy, built in New York on the east side of Manhattan. Drew a lot of people, a lot of attention because of its size, and took a while to build it. and to put it on its trials and so forth. Its steam and sail, although you can't see the smokestacks in this picture, but it was a very impressive ship built by the United States on a contract with the Russian government, and for the then Minister of Navy, Grand Duke Constantine, the brother of Tsar Alexander II. Part of this, I've already talked about the anniversary. Well, I didn't mention that the occasion in Volgograd was to celebrate the anniversary of the beginning of the American Civil War in 1861, the sesquicentennial of the American Civil War, and there's other observances going on, and a lot of books are coming out. And the Russians are always quick to launch into anniversary celebrations, as they did with the founding of the beginning of diplomatic relations. There were a couple of conferences in Russia, which I was able to attend in 2008 and 09, that period. So that was where the conference, and we'll see more. There'll be celebrations of the purchase sale of Alaska, I'm sure, coming up in 2017, something like that. The Americans. Cassius Marcellus, well, there's Abraham Lincoln, of course. He didn't know anything about Russia. He had a Secretary of State, William F. Seward, who knew a lot about foreign affairs and quite a bit about Russia, unusually. He had written a biography, published biography of John Quincy Adams, which had a full chapter on John Quincy Adams's mission to Russia. He was the first minister to Russia at the beginning of relations. And so he knew something about Russia, certainly from that, and from his general contact with Bodisko and with Steckel, as we'll see. Cassius Marcellus Clay, the son of a Green Clay, who served in Washington's Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, and then was a general in the War of 1812. Just been reading something about his activity in 1812. There's another celebration going on, the bicentennial of the War of 1812, currently. He was from Virginia, but because he was involved with surveying in what was then Western Virginia, Kentucky, and laid out an estate for himself in the process, and had a big plantation there in central Kentucky. And that's where Cassius Marcellus Clay. Now, he was obviously a student of Roman history, since he named two of his sons, Cassius Marcellus, and the other one was Brutus, Brutus Clay. So, and they were destined for a classical education as they grew up, and went to Center College, which was featured on one of the debates recently, and to study Roman and Greek, and history. Then to Transylvania College, and Cassius then went on to Yale, and earned an honors degree from Yale, which was something in those days, talking about the 1830s, and met a number of abolitionists while he was in New England. Now, he would be the heir to a large plantation of quite a few slaves. I don't know the exact number, but a sizable number of them. But because of his contact with the abolitionists in New England, he had decided to free his slaves before the Civil War, around 1850, in fact. And so his slaves were free. Now, you may be asking, is this connected to another Cassius Marcellus Clay, better known as Muhammad Ali, famous heavyweight boxer? And yes, it is. A slave, freed slave, named his son Cassius Marcellus Clay after the owner who freed them, and that person then named son was Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., actually. So that name gets passed in through, and he is still living, I guess, but not very well, of Parkinson's disease. Anyway, that is a bit of trivia. Cassius Marcellus Clay knew nothing about diplomacy or Russia, but was a staunch supporter of Abraham Lincoln and a founder of the Republican Party, one of the premier founders, in fact, of the Republican Party. There he is. He was a striking individual, handsome, 6'4", same height as Abraham Lincoln. Someone said there was only one person who could stand up to Lincoln, and that was Clay, because he is the same height. That's pretty tall, 6'4", for those years at that time, and certainly for anyone in Russia. He towered above most Russians during his tenure in St. Petersburg. One of the stories, there's various stories about why he went to St. Petersburg. He was appointed first minister to Spain, but turned it down. And then somebody talked him in, wouldn't it be nice for you went to St. Petersburg and really softened up the Tsar in favor of the Civil War, and the Union side of the Civil War? And he agreed to go. He may have had other things in mind. He took his wife, his nephew, his family, all that. The Green Clay Diaries describe quite a bit of his tenure there. He also had a good secretary, besides Green Clay, Bayard Taylor, who was a well-known travel writer and so forth. So that, and quite a few Americans in St. Petersburg, which were associated with the railroad building and other industries. The Winans brothers, that's the home of the Clays in Kentucky. White House, it was called. Okay. I've got Bayard Taylor down there. Now, Cassius decided to come back to America to seek a commanding position in the Union Army. That didn't work out, but in the meantime, Simon Cameron, who had been Secretary of Treasury initially under, was sent, and I've got the Winan brothers. The Winan brothers were the largest manufacturing, had the largest factory in Russia at the time, and had it for 30, 40 years. The Alexandrovsky Works outside of St. Petersburg. And so they were from Baltimore, but staunch Union Northern supporters. And a number of other Americans were also in that category. And so Clay had a lot of support for the Union in St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg society was 100% for the Union. And there are several reasons for that. They felt an identity with the northern part of America. They had just were going through the emancipation of the serfs, and felt a kinship with the reforms of Abraham Lincoln. And also, the reforms of Abraham Lincoln are not just the emancipation, but had to do with lands, what to do with the land, the Homestead Act, the Railroad Land Grant Act, and a number of other things. It was, I think it really should be called the Lincolnian Revolution, the Second American Revolution. That's what the Russians call it. The Civil War is the Second American Revolution. The Russians, this is Lincoln and his cabinet. Notice the cabinet is fairly small in those days. Not a lot of bureaucracy. Front and center in this picture is William Seward, the Secretary of State. And Lincoln is sort of, kind of in the background a little bit. And there's Seward again. Probably one of the, if there's anyone who could, in the 19th century who could be called a statesman in American history, I think Seward probably would get that nod. Here are the Russians. Now, there was nothing that could be said who was un-American about Cassius Clay. He was rooted in the Midwest, in Kentucky. He was a lineage going back to the Revolutionary War, etc. Although he, and this was a big advantage at St. Petersburg, spoke French fluent. And that was not common for an American at that time. People on the Russian side, Alexander Gorchakov, of course, is the chancellor, the counterpart, foreign minister, the counterpart to Seward in America. I don't think that Lincoln and Alexander II really had much to do with saving the Union, with the Russians saving the Union or the American diplomacy. I'd say Gorchakov and Seward were the people who really masterminded the Russian support for the Union. Edward D'Estaco, the complete opposite of Clay. He's not Russian. Very seldom ever went to Russia. I counted once or twice he visited Russia. Born in Constantinople. His father was Austrian. His mother was Italian. But his mother was the wife of the Russian minister to Constantinople, who was Italian, Pisani, and that was not unusual at the time. And that's how he gained access into the Russian foreign ministry, was through his mother's family. But I don't know that he even spoke Russian. He certainly spoke French and English and German well. He was married to an American. He was more American, certainly, than anything else, because he had lived in America since the 1830s. So he's been there 30 years when the Civil War comes about. And he's now the minister because when the previous Bodisco fell from his horse and died, he came in as chargé d'affaires and then was minister. And so he's been minister in Russia, in America since 1855, and is the dean of the diplomatic colony, widely respected by everybody. Vladimir Bodisco is the nephew of the minister Bodisco, who's also been in Russia and been in America for 30 years, and is his secretary. And Lisovsky, I'll come back to it a little bit. Stepan Lisovsky was the admiral in command of the Russian squadron that came to New York in 1863. And we have these ships of the war as a visible presence in American harbors in San Francisco and New York and in the Potomac. I was just reading recently an account in the Washington Post of the visit of the fleet to Washington, anchoring in the Potomac just off Alexandria in late December, early January, 63, 64. And having a reception at the White House and a dinner sponsored by, of course, Seward. So the presence of the Russian Navy made a big difference. And who orchestrated that? It was Steckel, Clay, and Gorchakov, Grand Duke Constantine, who arranged to have the Russian fleet make this very visible. What was their purpose? In case England would intervene on the side of the Confederacy, they would go to war. They were prepared to, if necessary. The ships carried double crews, and there were a number of auxiliary ships that went with them. There were only 6 major ships, men of war, but there were auxiliary ships as well, and double crews. And they made a point of making a real presence, and everyone knew it. It's covered in all the magazines and newspapers. The visit that lasted 4 months. They arrived in August and left in January of 64. So And this helped seal British and French neutrality. They weren't going to get involved in any more support from the Confederacy than they already had. And with that sealed off, the Union was saved. Now, that's part of the story, at least. Here's Steckel, that dapper, I think 5'6", complete physical contrast to Cassius Clay. He never went back to Russia. He went back to Russia to arrange or get instructed on the sale of Alaska in December of 1866. There's proof of that. But you know, he's not really Russian, and when he does retire, leaves America in 1869, he goes to France with his American wife, and they're part of the American community in France, in Paris, and then he dies a little later. This is a scene of a ball with the Russian officers in New York during that period. There's the Oslaba, one of the ships. This is outside of Alexandria in the Potomac. There's another view of the Oslaba. This is Steckel at the signing of the treaty of negotiating the sale of Alaska. And there's the globe, and he's pointing his finger, his thumb actually, at Alaska, just to let them know where it is. Because a lot of Americans didn't know what Alaska was or where it was. And sort of a look-alike behind him in the middle, behind the globe, is Vladimir Bodisko. Looks very much like Steckel, but they were not related that I know of. And Seward is sitting there with the map, or what looks like a map on his lap. That's the sale of Alaska, which comes out of the saving of the Union. All of that was going on. I tossed this in because in 1866, just before the sale of Alaska, we sent a fleet to Russia to thank them for their support of the Union. And we sent a monitor, which had been completed at the end of the war and was not used in the war, as a token of the new Navy. It was such a bad crossing. You can imagine what it would be like to cross the Atlantic in a ship like that, that it never came back. They sold it for scrap in the Baltic somewhere, but it did make it to St. Petersburg. The Vian Tanoma, named after an Indian chief, was the name of that ship. It's had the surface of the deck was 6 inches above the ocean. No one could get up on deck during the crossing, so that was something. I think I will say a few more words about the reports that were coming in from Steckel going to St. Petersburg and Cassius Clay coming back from St. Petersburg, the reports of Steckel. As I said, Steckel possessed a definite advantage over his American diplomats in Russia. He read and understood American history and literature and was well established in American society, while Clay and his staff arrived in Russia without knowing anything. Officials in St. Petersburg were thus well informed of the approaching conflict through Steckel's dispatches. In 1860, he reported the surprise emergence of, quote, an obscure lawyer from Illinois at the Republican National Convention, 28 May. But that, quote, time will tell if he possesses the moderation and energy to calm the spirits and save his country from the dangers that threaten it. It's pretty good. Well, this is, of course, the original's in French. My translation. While describing the South in uproar after Lincoln's election, he quoted again, in the North, where it is comparatively quiet a vague worry agitates all classes of the population. And he finally went on that same year, that's just 1861, that the last hope of reconciliation has disappeared, that Russia should recognize the Southern Confederacy only after it is constituted formally and as soon as it regularizes its relations with the Northern Republic by the establishment of diplomatic relations of a permanent character. Of course, that would never happen. That was Russia's official position in regard to the war, the Civil War. We'll recognize the Confederacy, but only after the Union does. That's not going to happen. And Steckel refused to join a mission of the British and French ministers to Richmond to negotiate with the Confederacy, and stood beside all the way, stood beside Seward all the way. Regarding Clay, Steckel informed St. Petersburg, they say he is a popular orator of great ability who by his discourses contributed to the election of Lincoln, which is true. This is a man of the West who will not be very versed in the diplomatic services. That was putting it mildly. Green Clay in his diary witnessed, he was of course green to old St. Petersburg as well, described the initial audience with Gorchakov. The prince is over middle-aged looking man, has an intelligent face and some marks of severe thought, is pleasing in his manner, plainly dressed, slightly bald, slightly stooped. He also described walks along the sea with the minister and described going to Lake Ladoga and to industrial and craft exhibits. Clay wore his uniform and was much stared at and usually saluted. He described the Tsar, on the audience with the Tsar at Tsarskoye Selo, that he was obviously impressed with the Tsar. A nobler piece of humanity I never beheld, a frank, open, determined countenance. And then they were treated to a nice, lavish luncheon there, and Clay added in his diary, "Let it be said that the Russians are great eaters and wine drinkers." And this was followed by a set speech in Russian translated by Gorchakov. These were the accounts that were coming out of St. Petersburg, but the whole atmosphere seemed to have been, that we're in this together almost, that we have things at stake, liberation, reforms, all of that. And one thing I'd add about Clay, when he did come back to America, there's some confusion and not quite clear exactly what was going on. But he made it clear that if he didn't get what he wanted when he came back to America, he could go back to Russia. So he reserved his place, you might say, back in St. Petersburg. And then when he did return, he returned without famine and was notorious for some of his activities in bedrooms of ballerinas, and brought back, in fact, a little boy when he came back the second time, who he raised as his son from St. Petersburg. He wrote to a friend, Mrs. Cassius Clay, "Russia stands by us in good and bad report. I have reason to believe the more I see of Russia that the people, great and low, are better and wiser and more civilized than we were led to believe by the British, who slander all whom they desire to crush." So that's Clay's, you might say, effort to bring about his understanding, his own belief that the two nations would stand together in saving the Union. I think perhaps the most important thing out of all this Russian-American relationship during that period is the sending of the Navy and the morale boost that it gave to the Union, the people in the North states, just after, this came just after the Battle of Gettysburg. So everything was pretty much downhill. The Russian officers from the fleet actually went inland and observed the Battle of Vicksburg on the Mississippi, which has sometimes been called the turning point of the Civil War militarily. So, questions, comments?
Yeah, I got one. What?
down there kind of disrupt things and, well, let's succeed and do all this, and then they start putting landmines, you know, that's a criminal offense. But you'll never hear that on Russian TV, because I watched it. You never hear that. It was like all about these Georgians are coming through the tunnel and attacking us in Russia. You know, it's state-sponsored media, which was kind of sad, because I was hoping, you know, I know a lot of Russians, and I was hoping, you know, hopefully someday they'll get rid of that state-sponsored media.
Well,
And it's very serious. It's very serious. I mean, it's not you know what the most